And the Minister of Education wishes to make a statement. Minister.
Ladacaid, Las Concordia, ba while I'm righteous a yanu, ar an vrennu nausplach ar an scam Colin ta viniha, vici who ar jaru v anar August, brak huntus a horich ar a conas maratache, barty ha agam, ruddy a horich hun tusig. With your permission, Las Concordia, Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the independent review of the Common Funding Scheme, which was published at the end of January, and to outline how I intend to move forward. Members will recall that I was not satisfied the Common Funding Scheme, which determines how funds are allocated to schools, was fit for purpose. I did not believe that the scheme adequately supported my key policy objectives, in particular raising standards, targeting social need and building a network of strong and sustainable schools. Ta August, Ve am Hocus or Tus, or Sha a Horich da Dalti Agoni. Current Sha Taka Fui Gak policy ata occur a Vaim Agam, August Gak Kinu a Hogum Mar ar Idjahis. My focus and always will be on putting pupils first. This underpins every policy I am implementing and every decision I undertake as Education Minister. I therefore commissioned an independent panel led by Sir Bob Salisbury to examine this area and to report back to me. I wish to thank Sir Bob, Evan Bates and Amber Evers for all their work on this review. I know that they engaged in an extensive consultation and meetings as part of this exercise. Their report was published and placed on my department's website at the end of January. Members will have had time to examine it and the 29 wide-ranging recommendations it contains. I specifically sought the Education Committee's views on the report and recommendations contained within, and I want to thank the Committee for its detailed consideration of the report, for the consultation with stakeholders that it undertook to inform its response, and for the response it provided to me. I also encourage consideration of the report by the Strategic Forum established by my department. This forum facilitates engagement between education trade unions and senior staff in my department and in the education and library boards and other arm's-length bodies we sponsor. These views have helped shape and inform my thinking on the way forward. Deputy Speaker, I have already outlined to the Assembly in earlier statements how I intend to drive up standards and to move forward on embedding area-based planning. This report on our common funding scheme and my response to it are about continuing and reinforcing that direction of travel. I want to make clear that commissioning this review was not about saving money, it was about making better use of the funding we have, using it to promote strong, vibrant schools that put pupils and their needs and aspirations first. In the next couple of weeks following this statement, my department will publish a revised common funding scheme for consultation. The changes it will contain will reflect the recommendations in the review report and my response to them. While today's statement provides an opportunity for me to set out my position on the key recommendations, I am also publishing in more detail a formal response to each of the 29 recommendations made by the Independent Review Panel in its report. The Independent Review Panel made a number of recommendations relating to how we allocate and monitor funding and account for it. These included recommendations relating to restricting the number of funded initiatives for schools, reviewing earmarked funding, and ensuring that where earmarked funding or short-term funding is necessary, there is a clear exit strategy. I am accepting the recommendations in respect of limiting earmarked funds and maximising the amount of monies that will go directly to schools via the aggregated schools budget. This is what schools told the review panel they wanted, so I will review the earmarked funds that currently go to schools to establish whether they could in fact be added to the aggregated schools budget and delegated directly to schools. It will not be possible or indeed appropriate to remove every earmarked budget, but I will ensure that they are all reviewed to test whether they need to remain. In that context, it is important that I make clear my view that money delegated to schools should be spent on improving the outcomes for the children and young people at those schools. My department already has limits for surpluses and deficits in place. These recognise that schools need flexibility and provide for schools to accumulate modest deficits or surpluses up to 5% of their total budget, or 75,000, whichever is lesser. However, too many schools are outside these limits. For example, last year 86 primary schools were holding surpluses in the excess of £100,000. and of 7 of these had surpluses in the excess of £250,000. The review has recommended that there should be stronger financial challenges and intervention procedures for schools with excessive surpluses and deficits, similar to those in place in relation to school improvement. Principal Deputy Speaker, it cannot be good practice that some schools are sitting on what can only be described as large surpluses when that funding was voted by this Assembly to be spent on educating the pupils they have enrolled. It is even less tenable for schools where educational outcomes are low to be hoarding surpluses that could be spent improving those outcomes. Equally, schools are no different from any other publicly funded bodies. They must live within the resources allocated to them and must not run up deficits. When that happens, the money needed to cover these deficits has to be found from other parts of the education service. That too is not tenable. The best education systems internationally combine a high level of autonomy for schools with a high level of accountability. I am committed to allowing schools the flexibility and freedom to make decisions on how best to meet the educational needs of their pupils within their budgets. I am equally committed to ensuring there is robust accountability for the outcomes they achieve. In that context, Deputy Principal Speaker, the review also recommends that my department should explore the practical implications of allowing any school to adopt a system of financial management operated for voluntary grammar schools and grant-maintained integrated schools. Some schools have made clear to me that they would welcome the freedom that they perceive comes with having their own bank accounts. Others have made it equally clear that they view that this would be a burden they do not wish to carry. I will accept this recommendation to explore this further. It is my intention to explore it once we have progressed the education bill and ESA has been established. The independent review also makes several recommendations designed to ensure that arrangements for funding schools support more effectively my department's sustainable schools policy and the work on area planning. This has been perhaps the most challenging aspect of reforming our common funding scheme. The review panel's view is that the current means of funding small schools does not acknowledge the need to improve how we plan our schools estate on an area basis. The panel recommended that I remove all small schools factors from the current funding. However, it has to be recognised that strategically important small schools would, in that scenario, have to be supported by funding outside the new formula in order to deliver effective education for their pupils. Mr. Speaker, I know there has been much concern expressed with this recommendation. While I am accepting the recommendation in principle, I am not, however, implementing it at this time. Small schools should be reassured that these factors will not be removed from the common funding formula overnight. I do want to signal, though, that while small schools factors in the current formula will be retained for the 2014-15 financial year, schools and managing authorities should not rely on the continuation of the funding allocated via these factors in the long term. And as I have stated previously, all 6 sustainable schools criteria have to be taken into account when deciding the future of a school. A budget inflated through the small school factor is not a single deciding factor for sustainability. I reserve the capacity to make further adjustments to the funding formula, including the small schools factors in future years, to reflect and respond to the progress on area planning. Deputy Principal Speaker, the area planning work currently underway aims to have the right schools that are the right type and the right size in the right place. Those area plans may determine that there is a need for a small school, and I can assure the Assembly that where there is the case, small schools that have been identified as strategically important will receive the resources they need to provide the best possible education for the children they serve. The difference from the current position is that these small schools will be planned and approved. They will not be there just because they have always been there, but because they represent the best solution for young people in that area. The panel also recommends the development of a small schools policy that identifies and safeguards strategically important small schools. I have no difficulty with the thinking behind this recommendation, but I do not believe that another policy is necessary. We already have a sustainable schools policy that sets out the criteria and quality indicators to help managing authorities to assess schools' sustainability. We already have an extensive area-based planning process underway designed to ensure that schools are planned strategically to deliver sustainable, high-quality education. Within this existing policy, I will provide further clarification on the circumstances as to when a small school will need to be retained and how it will be supported. My focus in moving forward this element of the reform will be to concentrate on implementing the policies we already have and ensuring that funding arrangements support these policies. I do not intend to introduce another policy that I do not believe is needed. What is needed are decisions. Funding for our young people with special educational needs is also covered by the report. The review therefore considers the pros and cons of the funding our special schools being the funding formula. It also includes specific recommendations relating to funding to support pupils with special educational needs and funding for special schools. There are challenges associated with adopting a formulaic approach to allocating funding for SEND support when that support is designed to reflect the individual needs of a pupil with special educational needs and will therefore vary from pupil to pupil. Quite sensibly, the independent review concluded that such funding does not, at this time, lend itself to allocation via a formula. I agree with that conclusion. However, I am conscious that leaders in our special schools want to have greater autonomy, greater delegation, greater flexibility to make decisions. And I know from speaking to them that they accept too the need for greater accountability. I am therefore accepting the recommendation that consistent financial management information should be recorded for special schools in order to inform decisions on planned spending. That is a sensible practice. It should already be happening. Where it is not happening already, I will expect the necessary steps to be put in place. The recommendation also calls for a specific review of special school funding once that practice of setting down and reviewing consistent financial information has bedded in. I want to explore further with governors and school leaders in special schools what more might be done to ensure that the route by which they receive their funding does not impede their ability to make decisions that are best made at school level. A key focus of the independent panel's review was to examine how a revised funding formula would better support my determination to address educational underachievement and help break the link between social disadvantage and low educational outcomes. A system which, despite continued yearly improvement, still sees disadvantaged pupils only half as likely to achieve 5 GCSE or equivalents at Grade A* to C, including English and Maths, as their more affluent counterparts, presents in education and economic a political challenge that we as legislators cannot ignore and cannot allow to continue. I am pleased, therefore, that the review panel addressed the significant dimensions of its remit with vigour. It recognised that pupils from socially deprived backgrounds have greater obstacles to overcome and that schools need to do more to assist them in breaking this linkage. And it makes very clear through the evidence-based recommendations that more funding should be targeted at pupils from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. The review also recognised that the issues schools face in overcoming barriers created by social deprivation are significantly increased with increasing numbers of children from less affluent backgrounds. The panel therefore recommended that funding for socio-economic deprivation should be weighted towards schools with significant concentrations of disadvantage to reflect the negative effects of such concentrations. It will be no surprise to members, therefore, to note that I accept and fully endorse these recommendations. Indeed, Deputy Principal Speaker, I intend to inject a further £10 million into school budgets next year, with that funding being allocated to help schools with the greatest concentrations of disadvantage to address underachievement among their disadvantaged pupils. While this will be good news for many schools, I do ever want to make it clear that the extra money will need to be accounted for. In order to draw down this additional funding, schools will need to set out how they plan to use it to help pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to achieve their full potential. They will have flexibility in identifying actions, but they will be held to account for the outcomes they deliver. I expect these interventions to link teaching and learning with the work that these schools undertake as extended schools, and to involve outreach to parents and communities as well as direct support for young people themselves. ESA will have a critical role to play in scrutinising schools' plans and supporting schools in identifying suitable interventions to meet pupils' needs. The Inspectorate will also ensure that, through the inspection process, there is an appropriate focus on the outcomes achieved for pupils with this funding. Before leaving the area of social deprivation funding, members will note that the review panel also made reference to the methodology my department uses to allocate this funding. I am pleased that the review recognised free school meals entitlement as the best available indicator of social disadvantage, but I am also content to accept the recommendation that this is something that should be kept under review. If a better measure emerges, it is only right that we should consider it. The review also recommended that I consider adjusting the eligibility criteria for free school meals. It is important that I signal the complexity the proposed welfare reform introduces in this area. The proposed introduction of universal credit will, if agreed, require us to change the eligibility criteria for free school meals and indeed for assistance with the cost of school uniforms. I will shortly have to reach decisions on the trigger points for eligibility, and I will announce more detail on this at the appropriate time. For now, Deputy Principal Speaker, I can confirm that whether eligibility is determined under the current arrangements or any new arrangements, it is my intention to apply the same eligibility criteria for free school meals for both primary and post-primary pupils from September 2014. This means that post-primary pupils from our lowest income families will be supported with access to free school meals in the same way as our primary pupils. It also ensures that the post-primary schools they attend will be supported in a similar way. Balance of funding between primary and post-primary schools has also been an area of interest to the review. There has been considerable interest in the balance of funding between primary and post-primary schools. The review has recommended that this should be kept under review. I accept entirely the importance of early intervention, and I know that nursery and primary schools have long campaigned for more funding, making the point that they could deliver so much more with additional funding. Primary schools have equally made it clear to me that additional funding for them should not be at the expense of post-primary schools. All the evidence shows that our post-primary schools are facing real challenges at present. We know that they are seeing the impact of earlier demographic decline that has stabilised at primary level, and that they are much more likely to be facing challenges in living within budget than their primary counterparts. We know too that while our primary schools are outperforming most other countries, the same cannot be said about some of our post-primary schools. When resources permit, I will consider the scope to increase primary school funding. I will not do this at the expense of post-primary schools. However, what I want to do in preparation for that time is to ensure that the future education ministers have the levers they need to target funding to primary schools. One of the drawbacks of our current formula is that its complexity inhibits our ability to do this. Therefore, I will be consulting with schools on a model that will, for the future, see us operating two separate formulae, one for primary and nursery schools and one for post-primary schools. Deputy Principal Speaker, members and of course schools will want to know how all of this will affect the make-up of the common funding formula and the funding for their individual schools. The review panel set out very clearly the key principles that should underpin a new common funding scheme, and I have accepted these. The review panel also urged me to consider implementation of a new funding formula made up of a range of elements with clear focus on funding to reflect pupil rather than institutional needs, and to provide support for young people. Those from disadvantaged backgrounds or who face other barriers with clear purposes of ensuring that schools are funded equitably, transparently and reflecting the needs of the pupils they serve. Work is well advanced on a new funding formula, informed by the recommendations in the review report, and I intend to launch a consultation on it in the coming weeks. In conclusion, Deputy Principal Speaker, the independent review of the common funding scheme provides us with a sound basis for making change that will improve how schools are funded and ensure that funding more closely supports my core policy priorities. While I have not accepted every single recommendation, I have accepted the vast majority. My officials are currently finalising a model that reflects the position that I have outlined today. I remain determined that the changes will be made from next April. I therefore plan to issue details of the proposals in the next couple of weeks so that schools will have time to consider them. Considering that although schools are not closed for the duration of the summer holidays, teachers and governors do, like the rest of us, need a summer break. I plan to extend the consultation period into October to give ample time for schools to digest the proposals and provide views. I will, of course, want to hear views from other stakeholders too. My officials will be happy to brief the Education Committee in more detail in the coming weeks, and will arrange to place a copy of the consultation document in the Assembly Library for members' consideration as soon as it is ready. Mr. Speaker, I believe that reform of how we fund our schools is needed if they are be able to deliver the outcomes for our young people that we need to deliver for them. Bawylum na Bali, a Hakam na Fawas, a Yanu Alegi Amak. Nis Tawataki na Shaw, Bawylum na Swinchi Shaw Hostel la Scullana, August Ladini alla Fakinch and Will, Ray Tig Nish for, Nona Kin, Hockey Mead Suez Low. I want to set out how I think improvements can be made. More importantly, I want to test these ideas with schools and with others to explore whether there are, in fact, better solutions than the ones we will come up with. Ray take a Frager, Fragarch, Nice for Armo, Ying Valschacht, Oucha Horch Dialti. Solutions that can more effectively respond to my determination to put pupils first.
Mr. Mervyn.